Flash outside the off stump. Episode 2. Exodus.
Cricket, lovely cricket. At last where I saw it. Cricket, lovely
Although by 1700 cricket in England was still largely confined to the south-eastern corner of the country, isolated games had begun to take place abroad as those who played the sport at home took it with them on their travels. After the political and social upheavals of the 17th century, the newly united Kingdom of Great Britain began to increasingly look outwards at the world and began to build a mercantile empire. Britain's near-continental neighbours, France, Spain and Portugal, had already staked out huge claims to much of the New World, while the Netherlands had become Europe's economic powerhouse off the back of the huge wealth generated by their dominance of the trade routes to Asia. Muscling in on this game of empires dominated British foreign policy for much of the next 100 years or so, and, having reached the top of the pole after the defeat of Napoleon, staying there was the focus for the next 100 years or so after that. All this expansion required lots of soldiers and sailors to secure territory, and civil servants, engineers and businessmen to exploit it. One of the features of the British Empire was that most of it had much warmer weather than Britain for much of the year, and so it was that it was the summertime sport of cricket that the colonists tended to play in their spare time. It should be stressed, however, that although cricket was being played abroad, it was almost exclusively Britons who were playing, and would remain so for some time. Eventually, in the late 19th century, Britain would export football to the world too. Comparatively simple to grasp the rules of and perhaps easier to play, it is this relative newcomer which eventually became the world's dominant sporting obsession. It's fast, and it's over in an hour and a half, making it very attractive as a mass participation sport, particularly to working class communities with limited leisure time.
Roll up, one and all, the greatest show on earth is playing in town next Saturday. Watch your heroes kicking a ball.
Cricket, on the other hand, certainly took longer to play, longer to understand, and longer to master. Furthermore, cricket came with baggage, not just in the sense of the kit bag, although the cost of good cricketing equipment has never been particularly cheap, but in the sense of the social niceties that accompanied the game. By the time cricket arrived in the colonies, it had already become something of a social ritual which, at least nominally, demanded gentlemanly behaviour and fair play. The playing of cricket also provided social occasions, which brought together the most important people in colonial communities, giving them ample time to discuss politics and commerce while they watched the match or waited to bat. Initially, there was an assumption that foreigners in general, and the natives of other continents in particular, had neither the temperament nor the intellect to play, and the game was reserved for expatriates. Eventually, attitudes changed, and as the 19th century progressed, cricket was increasingly seen as a means by which the native inhabitants of Britain's colonies could be raised up to a level approaching, if not yet equal, to their colonial masters. Cricket wasn't necessarily seen as suitable for all, but was a very useful tool in fostering a sense of belonging among the emerging middle classes, both among settler communities and indigenous people. Along with the church, cricket came to be seen as a civilising influence and cornerstone of colonial life. The extent to which cricket was embedded into colonial identity goes a long way to explaining why it's taken so long to establish in countries without a history of extended occupation by the British. This legacy is still with us today. All 10 test-playing nations were once part of the empire. Looking farther down the international cricket rankings to include associate member countries, only Afghanistan and the Netherlands of the top 25 countries in the world do not have a former colonial relationship with the UK, although cricket was introduced to both of these countries by occupying British troops in 1839 and 1815 respectively. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The first record of cricket abroad precedes the existence of the Empire, and for that matter even the existence of the United Kingdom. On the 6th of May, 1676, the Reverend Henry Cheong, the naval chaplain of HMS Assistance, records that he attended a cricket match at Aleppo, now in Syria, but then part of the mighty Ottoman Empire.
This morning early, as is the custom all summer long, at least 40 of the English, with his worship the consul, rode out of the city at least 4 miles to the Green Plat, a fine valley by a riverside, to recreate ourselves. where a princely tent was pitched, and we had several pastimes and sports, as duck hunting, fishing, shooting, handball, cricket, scroffvilo, and then a noble dinner brought thither with great plenty of all sorts of wines, punch and lemonades, and at 6 we returned all home in good order, but soundly tired and weary.
The cricketers on this occasion were mainly merchants and diplomats. Although this quote from Chong's diary is widely believed to be the first mention of cricket abroad, 2 other tantalising references are also of interest. Adam Illyrius was a German who travelled to Persia in 1635, where he saw a game called Kreuzkalkan, which he describes as being like cricket, although he added that they also played the same game on horseback, with a description that sounded suspiciously like polo. There is also a contentious record of a game of cricket at Saint-Omer in the Pas-de-Calais in 1478. Some believe that this reinforces the idea touched on in the last episode, that cricket is in origin a French game. Others point out that all we know about the game at Saint-Omer is its name, which is simply the French word for grasshopper, and may just as well refer to something like leapfrog. Interestingly, when Illyrius described the game he saw in Persia, he said it was like cricket or mal. This latter word refers to pall-mall, a forerunner of croquet, popular in France and Italy by the beginning of the 1600s, and brought to England at the Restoration. The hoops used in pall-mall were very similar to the early cricket wickets, so it is possible that the cricket seen at Saint-Omer was more like croquet. The first place outside Britain where organised cricket seems to have taken place on a regular basis, though, is America, and until the mid-19th century was probably the strongest overseas cricketing nation. The earliest reference to cricket was in the diary of James Byrd II, who mentions playing at James River, Virginia, in 1709.
Yankee Doodle, keep it up, Yankee Doodle dandy. Mind the music and the step, and with the girls be handy. There was Captain Washington upon a slapping stallion.
There are further references to cricket in the American colonies throughout the 18th century. George Washington himself is recorded as playing at Valley Forge in the summer of 1788, but formalised cricket clubs only really became commonplace from the 1840s onwards, when a large number of clubs were founded in the area between New York and Philadelphia. Early references to cricket in America involve wealthy and influential figures such as Byrd, Washington and Benjamin Franklin, and 18th century American cricket seems to have been, like its English cousin, something of a rich man's pastime. In the early 20th century, as baseball eclipsed cricket in popularity, cricket was also perceived as a sport for wealthy elites, as the game survived in Ivy League colleges and clubs for British expatriates. The enormous expansion of American cricket in the 1840s was something different, though, being more of a mass movement. Philadelphia, in particular, became a centre of excellence, driven largely by an influx of mill workers from Yorkshire and Lancashire. So great was the popular enthusiasm in Philadelphia for cricket that in the first decade of the 1900s there were 120 clubs in that city alone, with the most successful club, Merion, claiming to attract crowds of up to 25,000 in the 1890s. One outcome of cricket's popularity as a spectator sport in America was that it became the setting for the first recorded international match. On the 24th and 26th of September 1844, at St George's Cricket Club in Manhattan, in front of an estimated 10,000 spectators on each day, Canada beat the Americans by 23 runs, with as much as $120,000 having been wagered on the outcome. Teams from England soon visited America too, and there were successful tours either side of the American Civil War. But the war seems to have acted as something of a watershed in the development of American cricket, with the game gradually becoming the preserve of an amateur elite, as baseball captured the hearts of the working class audiences previously attracted to cricket. Meanwhile, cricket had colonised other shores. As early as 1721, sailors of the East India Company had brought the game to Cambay in Gujarat. By the end of the century, the English had formed clubs in Calcutta and Seringapatam, soon to be followed by clubs in most other major settlements under British control. For some time, however, the game was only played by the British. When cricket began to be played by Indians in the mid-19th century, it took root gradually, and initially only among the better off. Elsewhere, the global nature of the Napoleonic Wars meant that the British armed services were going more places than ever before. Between 1800 and 1815, they took the game to places as diverse as Croatia, Belgium, Spain, South Africa and Argentina. In many of these places, the game went away again with the troops at the end of hostilities, but in one or two, it was taken up by a combination of locals and English residents. Cricket was also becoming established in Britain's other permanent colonies. The St Anne's Cricket Club in Barbados seems to have been the first formed in the West Indies in 1806. But artefacts such as the Barbados cricket buckle, which depicts a batsman in a slave collar, date from earlier, indicating that the game was being played by slaves as well as settlers from at least the 18th century, and by the 1850s it was well established in all the British West Indies colonies. Meanwhile, the loss of America had prompted the British to look for new locations for penal colonies to cope with the ever-expanding prison population at home. In 1788, the first prison fleet arrived in New South Wales, and, after a shaky start, soon became the basis for a thriving colony. It is likely that cricket played a part in communal life in Australia from quite early on. The first official record of a game in Sydney dates from December 1803, but a newspaper report from the Sydney Gazette the following month suggests that the game was already well established by this time.
The late intense weather has been very favourable to the amateurs of cricket, who have scarcely lost a day for the last month. The frequent and moderate heats might have been considered inimical to the amusement, but were productive of very opposite consequences, as the state of the atmosphere might always regulate the portion of exercise necessary to the ends this laborious diversion was originally intended to answer.
Several clubs were established in New South Wales by the 1820s, and in the other emerging states of Australia a decade later. By 1851, cricket was sufficiently advanced for intercolonial teams to be selected for games between the states. The matches between New South Wales and Victoria proved particularly attractive, with the 1853 fixture in Sydney attracting a crowd of 15,000. Large crowds generate large sums of money, and it wasn't very long before the Australian appetite for cricket attracted the attention of the professional cricketers of England. Having said this, the initial English tour happened almost by accident. In 1861, a Melbourne catering firm, Spires and Pond, raised the considerable sum of £10,000, with which they hoped to persuade Charles Dickens to embark on a reading tour of Australia. Dickens was initially enthusiastic, having previously had a very successful tour of America, but eventually decided to pull out. Spires and Pond's backup plan was a cricket team from Surrey, led by Heathfield Harman Stevenson. The tour was an enormous success, which doubled the caterer's investment and enabled them to relocate to new premises in the West End of London. Socially, Australia was a very different environment to England. Only a tiny fraction of the population came from the upper echelons of British society, almost all of them in the military or colonial service. The rest of the European population was composed largely of prisoners or ex-prisoners, most of whom had little or no hope of ever seeing their homes or families again. However, in comparison to Britain, Australia quickly established itself as a country which was remarkable for the degree of social mobility that was possible. Convicts who had escaped the gallows at home by the skin of their teeth, and who would have found it impossible to escape the stigma of felony even if they survived the punishment in the United Kingdom, suddenly found themselves in a land where life was brutal, but the possibility of redemption and advancement were distinct possibilities. After a few years' penal servitude, prisoners could set up in business or start farms. Many were encouraged to open up the interior and start ranching. Within a generation, some had become very wealthy indeed, and many had joined the professional classes of the colony. As the settlers pushed inland to establish ranches or prospect for minerals, they encountered native peoples, often with devastating effects. Diseases which were comparatively innocuous for Europeans were often fatal to the Aboriginal population. Furthermore, would-be settlers often had a callous disregard for the welfare of indigenous Australians, with some regarding them as little more than vermin, to be cleared from the land by any means necessary. For their part, the Aborigines initially had no understanding of Western concepts such as property, and would freely hunt the settlers' livestock. In this atmosphere, a cycle of violence soon developed in which the Aboriginal people invariably came off worse. But some ranchers employed Aboriginals as stockmen, sometimes in large numbers. The government also employed them as native police and trackers, often admittedly for use against their own people, but they also set up Aboriginal stations, similar to the Indian reservations of North America, in which they intended native people could live safely and learn the rudiments of British civilization. One of these rudiments was the game of cricket. Before long, Aboriginal cricket teams were in evidence across the country, and in the next episode we'll be looking at how it was one of these which was the first foreign team to visit England.